Africa, a continent rich in resources such as diamonds, precious metals, coal, and other assets. A continent that on paper should be flourishing. But whilst in theory Africa should be one of the world's richest continents, this is far from the case in actuality, and many of the world's poorest countries are situated in Africa. For instance, in Burundi, the average GDP is just $239. An unimaginably low rate, especially compared to countries found in Europe and North America. But with such natural fortune, why does Africa remain so very poor? Well, in this video, we are looking at why Africa is poor and why it's likely to stay that way for some time. Now first, let's go over the key details. Africa has no real reason to be poor. With a continental population of 1.2 billion, Africa finds itself with a lot of human resource, natural resource, and skill, but still lags significantly behind other continents in terms of wealth. This doesn't really make much sense, as Africa has no end of vital resources to provide. For instance, did you know that up to 70% of the world's cocoa beans come from Africa? And whilst GDP growth is set to increase much further by 2050, results that will be coming in by that time period still are not very significant. So let's rephrase the question to help us draw our analysis. Let's look at the past first. Let's start by asking, why has Africa been so poor for so very long? Now there are arguably many reasons for this, but to set the scene, let's go back to what is arguably considered where all of the modern problems began, and that came in the form of colonization, as colonization set the scenes for what has come in Africa today. It is effectively where a lot of the modern problems began, and I'm not saying that Africa was a perfect land before colonization, but it's important to acknowledge the effects that it had. Now the earliest African colonization dates back to the 1880s, where the European conquests took place of African territories, naming the land as their own. But it's no secret that they did not just sail there to name the land, as Europeans of the time enslaved, robbed and looted African countries, taking control of their vast wealth and manpower for their own benefit. And it's fair to say that there are other factors influencing Africa's modern day predicament, but it's also important to acknowledge the effects and the consequences that came with these invasions. They destabilized Africa, spreading disunity, poverty and famine through the continent, affecting the inner African culture, arguably forever. The decolonization of Africa started at the end of World War II. But just because European tyranny was coming to an end does not mean that Africa was completely free, as a new type of tyrant started to emerge in many African countries, and that came in the form of dictators and corruption. And this leads us very clearly into the modern day problems which Africa faces. Because Africa isn't necessarily a poor continent. One of the oppressive factors which Africa faces is wealth disparity between the general population and the dictatorship. For instance, remember when we spoke about Burundi just a couple of moments ago, where the average person lives off around $250 a year? Well, the president of that country makes around $50,000 a year. Now context is very important here, because whilst 50 grand may sound like a mediocre wage in many Western countries, this is arguably an unbelievable quantity of wealth compared to almost all people living in Burundi. And this form of oppression is one of the reasons why Africa is still so poor. But not exclusively, because upper echelons hoard a lot of the money. But there are more problems that come with running a brutal dictatorship, and that comes in the form of trade and business. Because inevitably, it's going to be hard to get a respectable, wealthy nation to land a substantial trade alliance with an unstable, war-torn country, especially when a platitude of other options are available. This is another problem that Africa faces at the moment. The continent is trapped due to a lack of stability, as that is something which Western nations are not going to look favourably on. And unfortunately, these domestic factors feed the vicious cycle of poverty, leading to less investment, leaving African nations without much to bargain with. But you'd think that the African dictators would be bothered about their countries, right? Well, generally, no. Obviously, Africa is a vast land, and each country's circumstances vary. But caring isn't really something that dictators do after all. Besides, life in Africa isn't exactly like that in Europe or the US. In many African countries, 100 grand is worth a lot more than what it would be relatively here. And therefore leaders are living comfortably. They live in opulence whilst their people starve to death. Now obviously, it's in a country's best interests to grow its economy strategically. But this is often a problem in a dictatorial system, as we have seen many times in the past. So we found out why Africa is poor, right? A negative tone has been set by colonization, but more so in the modern day problems we see things like war, tyranny and overall instability, making Africa a hostile place for potential investors. But these factors are all past or current. Let's have a look at what Africa's future may hold. And this could be more of the same, just with a different culprit this time. China. Yes, that's right. China's interests in Africa have started to rear their ugly head in recent years. For instance, since the 1990s, trade between Africa and China has increased by a staggering 700%, meaning that China is now Africa's biggest trading partner. And this video isn't about China, so we're not diving too deep down that rabbit hole. However, this could be very problematic in the future. Now certainly China is not working like the Europeans in the 1800s, but they certainly are using a soft approach to gain power. Let me quickly explain how this works. China has lots of money where Africa has comparatively little. Essentially, China can use its money to lend wealth to Africa, effectively debt-trapping nations. Now this would effectively result in Africa owing China a favour, to put it very simply. Now this is where we must remember the vast assets which are present in Africa, as this new form of debt-trapping Africa appears to be the next plan for exploitation, this time by the Chinese. So just as things started to look up slightly, somebody else steps in to scupper Africa's chances. And unfortunately this has been the way it has been for some time, as Africa is in a very tricky position. The internal conflict over the continent limits the stability within the countries. Combine instability with dictators who do not care about their nations, and we see no solutions to Africa's current poverty. Without proper leadership to resolve the issues, there isn't really much room for bargaining and negotiating. And this has allowed more oppressive forces to step in, further trapping African nations for their own benefit. And this cycle is something that we have seen for hundreds of years, and probably something that we should expect to continue with increased investment from China. So overall, whilst Africa's prospects are set to increase in the next 30 or so years, imagine if all of the political problems in Africa were resolved. As with better governments dedicated to helping their people and bringing about peace, Africa really could be one of the greatest continents on Earth. But the current administrations in many countries mean that they don't put people first, and this allows for all sorts of external forces to step in to make a quick. And this has allowed for all sorts of external forces to step in, allowing dictators to make a quick buck. So what do you think to this video, guys? I hope you enjoyed it. What do you think to the data that we showed? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I want to hear all of your views in the comments down below, so do let me know. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in our next episode next week. Goodbye,